Welcome to Healthy Canadians, your space for nuanced conversations and expert insights into the health topics that matter to us all. I'm your host, Beahen. With me, Alex Newman, co-host and producer.
Hey, Megan. How you doing?
Good, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing okay. Over the past, 3.5 years or so, though, I've been a little stressed out.
Oh, no. How come?
Well, 3.5 years ago, I became a parent.
That makes sense.
Yeah. But it's stuff in particular, right? So when my son was born, I started becoming hyper aware of all the things around me, like what chemical is in this product over here, or what particles are floating around in the air in my son's room or the living room. So I think hopefully today's conversation is going to be a little bit helpful for me.
I think it is going to be helpful. We're talking about environmental chemicals, and we're talking to Tyler Pollock. He's going to ease your fears a little bit because he's a scientist in the Environmental Health Science and Research Bureau at Health Canada.
Okay, interesting. Okay, well, before we jump in, though, a little bit of housekeeping. So, although Healthy Canadians is produced by Health Canada and the Public Health Agency of Canada, what we discuss won't always reflect the official positions or policies of the Government of Canada, but that's okay. These are conversations, not news releases.
Let's talk about environmental chemicals. Hi, Tyler. Welcome to Healthy Canadians.
Happy to be here.
So, Tyler, let's jump right in. What do you do at Health Canada?
So I'm a scientist, part of a team that works on the National Biomonitoring Program. That's a lot of words, but it essentially means that we measure environmental chemicals in people, in the Canadian population. And so my job sort of spans the entire spectrum of the National Biomonitoring Program, all the way from discussing with our partners and our stakeholders, in planning the program, in planning which chemicals we might measure, all the way through to implementing them as part of what's known as the Canadian Health Measures Survey. And then on the sort of back end is more the data analysis. Once we get the results in, once we know the levels of environmental chemicals in people, we can analyze those data and we can answer questions about how those chemicals are related to the population and are related to things like health outcomes in the population.
Okay, interesting. So what makes you passionate about this? What motivates you?
Yeah, so I really am interested in the environmental chemicals. It's sort of my background. I got into it, I would say, when I was in university. I took a biology and a psychology program at McMaster University in Hamilton. And so it kind of was the intersection of, how we think about things in the world from the psychology perspective. And then the biology lended itself well to, the cellular mechanisms for all the things that are happening in our bodies. And then I had an opportunity, sort of when I was wrapping up those studies, to look more closely into environmental chemicals and specifically how the various environmental chemicals that we might be exposed to interact in our bodies, and then sort of how we can make decisions in our daily lives about how to reduce our exposures to those chemicals.
That's super cool. And so over the years of you been doing this work, has anything changed in the world of environmental chemicals?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I would say it's always changing. There's always, new chemicals being produced. There's always new regulations coming into effect. There's decisions being made by, companies that make products and, companies that might be using these chemicals. And so it's sort of an always evolving perspective or angle on which chemicals people might be exposed to.
Cool. And does our understanding also sort of evolve as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So from the work that I do with Health Canada, of course, we're always considering and measuring new chemicals, ones that we haven't measured in the past to understand the levels in the Canadian population. And that sort of goes alongside any decisions that we might be aware of from companies using these chemicals or people's behaviors around using these chemicals, or even things like new regulations that come into place.
Cool. And what are environmental chemicals?
That's seems like it should be the most straightforward answer, but it's actually one of it's challenging to really define. But I'll give you the way that we think about it. So an environmental chemical is really any compound or element that exists in the environment, and so it could be in things like the air, it could be in water, it could be in the soil, it could be sort of in the Earth's crust, or it could be in things that we use every day, like household products, things like children's toys, cosmetics, personal care products, the furniture in our homes. So it's a pretty big, wide net definition.
Yeah, and we were talking a bit before too about sort of a lot of people say environmental contaminants too when we're talking about this stuff, and there's kind of a distinction too, right, between why we're saying chemicals more, and someone might be thinking environmental contaminants, right?
Yeah, so it's a pretty nuanced distinction. I'm sure there are a lot of like really scientific experts in the field that would have a slightly different nuanced definition than myself. But for me, environmental chemicals is a little bit wider of a net. It could be really any naturally occurring or human-made chemicals that exist in the environment. Whereas an environmental contaminant, in my mind, is a little more emphasis on the human-made chemicals and ones that could be, either by accident or intentionally released into the environment. So you can think things like chemical spills, for example.
And what risks do they pose to our health?
That is the $1 million question.
That's what you're working on, right?
Yeah, that's
okay.
the ultimate goal of not only my work and my close colleagues' work, but really the work of many, many, many teams and individuals within the government of Canada. And so, like I mentioned previously, my role is more on understanding the levels of environmental chemicals in the Canadian population, and then there would be several other teams that are responsible for putting that information in the context of health risk. But I can tell you, there's tens of thousands of environmental chemicals in the environment. But really, the focus is on maybe 5,000 or 6,000 or so that are responsible for the vast majority of production volume, which is a way of saying it's most likely that you'll encounter those 5,000 or 6,000 chemicals in your lifetime.
Okay, and could you name those individually?
Might need a longer podcast.
Just 5,000 or 6,000.
That's part two.
Yeah.
And the ones that we're worried about, what are like the specific impacts they could have on someone's health?
Yeah, so there's a pretty wide array of impacts. There's effects on the organs, so like liver effects, kidney effects. There's effects on the endocrine system, which is sort of the hormones that exist in our body, which are responsible for many different biological processes. But I think really, that's not necessarily what people are interested in when we think about health risks of chemicals. It's not really, everyone's interests. How does this chemical impact this, biomarker in the liver kind of thing? It's more the health conditions that we are aware of, things like, cardiovascular risk for things like heart attacks, could be things like, the development or the
like cancer risk.
Cancer risk, yeah. So the development
of
cancer in the body, things like that.
Yeah.
I think people probably have heard of some potential environmental contaminants when they hear about certain like misunderstandings perhaps in the media, like cell towers or chemtrails. But what are some actual like most common contaminants that people are exposed to? The ones that we should actually maybe be worried about or that we've heard about before?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I can say that chemtrails are not a thing. They're not real.
I think the line is contrails, right? Because it's
contrails.
Just condensation, right, that you're seeing.
Exactly.
That's my
Thank you
understanding.
for clearing that up.
Yeah. But in terms of the environmental chemicals that, people might generally be familiar with, so there's a bunch of, metals and elements that, might ring a bell. Things like lead is a big one, cadmium, mercury. But then there's a bunch of sort of more human-made chemicals. So things like plastics, preservatives, pesticides, and I can name specific ones that you might see on a product, for example, as you're walking up and down the aisles of a store. So you might be familiar with the BPA-free label. Yeah. So bisphenol A is a really popular, common environmental chemical. There are others, paraben-free on your cosmetics and personal care products. Phthalates-free is another one. So these are maybe more of the ones that people might be generally familiar with. Of course, there's like this really long list, 5,000 or 6,000 long.
We'll get to that later.
Really technical chemical names that may never really come across your radar, but we know that they exist and they're for sure being measured.
Maybe you could tell us a little bit also about like what other chemicals are people exposed to in their home?
Yeah, so within the home, you can think of a lot of different items that you routinely use. So, there are, for example, when you sit down on your couch or sofa, there would be a class of chemicals known as flame retardants. As part of that. And so those flame retardants serve a very important purpose. In the event that there was a fire in your home, they help to suppress that fire from spreading. So
they're good chemicals.
The use of them is good. Unfortunately, what that means is because they're in your couch or sofa, you are exposed to them, contact with your skin. They can be released. You can breathe them in. Now, fortunately, for the most part, they're not something that you need to worry about in terms of the health risk. They serve a much better purpose by reducing the spread of fire. But
which could be a real health risk.
For sure, yeah, definitely a serious danger. And then the easy examples are all of the various chemicals that are in, again, like cosmetics, personal care products that you apply, every day. Household cleaners, of course, have chemicals in them to help with the cleaning process.
I have a question too. Like, what about old houses? Because I bought a house, and it is from 1962. It's an oldie. We're really paranoid about lead in the water because we're not sure about the age of the pipes that are coming to the house and that the infrastructure's been updated and stuff. So like we routinely won't like drink any water until it's been run for a while in the morning. And like obviously you got to be super careful around like hot water tanks and not drinking that because that can have lead in it presumably too. But what are some of those kind of things that like have we made improvements on that with like new sort of builds and houses, or like is lead still a problem? Should I be terrified? I'm terrified. I need your help.
No, that's a really good question because it does bring into sort of that like behavioral aspect. So there are, still older homes that have lead in the pipes within the home. It's something that you can get tested, but generally your approach to running the cold water for a minute or so before you consume it, before you drink it, is a good one. It sort of like clears out whatever might be lingering in the pipes. Of course, you can also use water filters and things like that. But I will say there's a lot of information to reassure you. So lead levels in the population have come down around like 70 or 80% over the last 40 years.
Wow.
And since myself and my team have been measuring them in the Canadian population, which started in 2007, they've come down, around 50% or so. And so that's really reassuring. It means that the sources of lead in the environment must also be, reducing. And so, I would say it's not necessarily the case that you should be terrified of lead, although we do know that lead is a serious health concern. And lead is one of those chemicals that, unlike many of the other chemicals, there's really no safe threshold. And so the goal is that you want to reduce the levels of lead as much as reasonably possible.
It's funny because when we bought our place, like it was before we had our son, and we were all just like, yeah, whatever, it's no problem. And then as soon as, of course, we became parents, we're like, oh my God, everything's contaminated. We have to be careful with everything. So maybe it's mostly that, I'm sure, in our case.
I think it would be good for you to just address, like, are all chemicals bad?
No, it's certainly not the case that all chemicals are bad.
Do they all pose a risk to our health?
No. So we have, different approaches for how to think about the health risk of chemicals. And so, like I just mentioned, lead is one of those ones where there's no safe threshold. And so the idea is that any amount in the body could be, contributing to health risks. For most other chemicals, we can sort of come up with a good estimation of what the level would be that could be of concern. And so for many, many, many chemicals, the levels in which, people living in Canada are exposed are much lower than that threshold, that cause for concern. And so that's really reassuring. Of course, there's new approaches and there's always new information coming out about chemicals. And so those sort of thresholds, that level that's cause for concern could change over time. But in the same way, our exposure to the chemicals can change over time. We see that a lot of chemicals are going down in the population.
And is it an element, like we were talking to a food safety expert the other day, and she said something that stuck with me, that there's no good or bad bacteria.
Exactly.
There's just bacteria. And it's kind of the same thing, I imagine, right? Like chemicals are chemicals. It's kind of what you do with them, how they're used, right? That defines what their impact is. So
yeah, not thinking about it in so black and white
I
terms,
think we
right?
like to
It's
do
nothing
that.
is necessarily very good or very bad.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And, in the case of the flame retardants that are in your couch,
Right.
a lot of chemicals are used for a purpose.
Yeah.
People might not be aware, but, you see paraben-free on the label or on the container of your cosmetic or personal care product. And paraben is a preservative. And so there's different types of parabens. If you read the ingredients list on the back, I'm sure you could see things like methylparaben or propylparaben. Those are preservatives. And so they're there to stabilize the product, to make it shelf stable so that it lasts longer. And of course, if those are removed from a product, which can be a good thing in some cases if they're not necessary, but in other products, medicated products,
right,
they may be necessary. And then of course, the health risk of the parabens is not as severe as the product degrading unintentionally, kind of thing.
And so, how do you test for exposure? How do you test and know that something is posing a risk?
So, in terms of measuring the levels of chemicals in the Canadian population, which is really, again, what myself and my team do here at Health Canada. It's largely done through the Canadian Health Measures Survey. And so the Canadian Health Measures Survey, it started in 2007, so it's been going on for over a decade now. And it's a survey that's conducted or led by Statistics Canada in partnership with Health Canada and the Public Health Agency of Canada. And so generally how the survey works is it will travel around Canada every 2 years and collect, information and biological samples, as well as some physical measurements from around 5,000 to 6,000 people living in Canada every 2 years. And so that sample, even though it's only 5,000 to 6,000 people living in Canada, it's representative of the entire Canadian population. And so, over time, it visits every province, it visits, major cities and more rural settings. And that really allows us to measure the chemicals in people and to understand those levels. And so, of course, as part of the survey, people would, volunteer information about themselves and their health conditions, as well as there would be some collection of biological samples like blood and urine.
I really just wanted you to explain what a biological sample is. So are they testing when they're collecting that information? Is it testing the levels in a person, right? And so we're measuring what's in the environment more broadly, or what's at home, or everything?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and maybe something that I should clarify. So human biomonitoring is, of course, measuring the chemicals in people. And then there's this sort of whole complementary other work that's being done out of Environment and Climate Change Canada that actually measures those chemicals in the environment. Okay. So we use the term environmental chemicals because generally that's where they come from, things like air and soil and products. But those environmental chemicals in the context of my work are in people. So we're measuring them in people.
Well, and that's an important distinction too, because we often hear about those statistics and things, and you're like, well, how do they get that data? And well, that answers the question that people are volunteering things so that you can understand it better, because, as well as knowing what's out there, knowing what is inside of us is kind of the most impactful thing too, right?
Yeah.
In terms of our health.
And so what do we learn from that? Like, does everyone have the same amount of chemicals, or are they exposed in the same way? So are some people higher or lower? What does that look like?
Yeah, so through the Canadian Health Measure Survey, we've measured about over 250 environmental chemicals in the population now. And I know 250 doesn't sound like
no
a
5,000.
lot in terms of the 5,000 or 6,000, but we are really targeting the highest priority ones, the most important ones to measure. And again, it's so challenging. Even for 250, it's really difficult to talk broadly about the levels for all of them. But I can tell you that there's sort of this like array of exposures. Some of the chemicals that we measure, you find them in almost nobody. And so, they may still be there, but they're not at a high enough level for us to even be able to detect in your body. Whereas other ones, because of the sort of laboratory method being so sensitive and being able to pick up even these really trace amounts, we find them in everyone in the Canadian population.
Sure.
And so it's really that like spectrum and trying to understand, like why is it the case that for some of these chemicals they're in everyone? For example, lead is in virtually everyone living in Canada, but it's a naturally occurring element. So of course it's going to be, at some baseline level. And it's always worth saying, when we talk about these like, really prevalent exposures in the population, it's always worth saying that just because it's there does not mean it's a health risk, does not mean it's a health problem.
Right. But do you ever like test and find like a certain region or area has a chemical that is prevalent and that we're worried about? And then like, what do we do about it? Yeah.
So the data from the Canadian Health Measure Survey is really meant to be representative of the Canadian population as a whole. Okay. Or at least, there's people living in the 10 provinces, age 3 to 79 years old. But it is possible now to sort of like zoom in and focus on specific regions or areas in Canada. And so we're just starting to really like explore that angle. We do know that there are, of course, areas in Canada with higher exposures to certain environmental chemicals. And that's just because, often there's a known source of exposure.
Cool. So you're finding out things that like make sense. Or have you ever like found some results that you're like, whoa, we were not expecting that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Nothing jumps to mind in terms of individual chemicals.
Yeah.
But, I can say that we've started producing what we refer to as biomonitoring fact sheets. It's just a way to sort of distill the sort of complicated information about environmental chemicals down to in a format that's more accessible and more tangible for most people. And so, in pursuing the development and the preparation of those biomonitoring fact sheets, we started to take a really close look at how the chemical levels are changing over time. Now that we have many years of data available. And so I think it was, surprising for us that it was really consistent that a lot of the chemical levels are declining in the population, which is really good news. There are some, of course,
surprising good news.
Yeah, there are some, of course, that are pretty stable, not changing. There are a handful that are increasing the population. Of course, we're going to continue to measure those, but it's just the sort of the system seems to be working as intended. The regulations come in place. People become aware of certain chemicals and decide, to take action to reduce their own exposures. And so those levels of chemicals in people come down over time.
I think people listening might be wondering or curious about their own levels now. And I want to reassure people, but also maybe you can give some like practical information to people about like, how do you keep your risk low?
Yeah. So it's really challenging to get any insight into your own environmental chemical levels in your body. It's not the case like, you go to the doctor and you can find out the levels of different blood markers.
You're not going to get blood work done.
Yeah.
Just find that out.
You can't go into a clinic and just ask them to measure all the environmental chemicals.
You just don't know.
But, it could be, reassuring to hear that like it is being looked at on a population level, and there's a lot of information online, through like government websites, both in Canada, the United States, Europe. There's a lot of information out there on environmental chemicals. There's also a lot of research and reports coming out of universities that really demonstrate where you encounter and are exposed to those chemicals. So like, what are the sources? An example that jumps to mind and is more prevalent in the news these days is per and polyfluoroalkylated substances. We call them PFAS because that's a horrendous name.
Yeah, PFAS I've heard of, yeah.
Yeah, so PFAS are in the news a lot. And it's becoming more apparent just how just how many products they're being used. And so there are ways, for people to go online and look up that information and get a better understanding of where those chemicals might be used in order to make decisions in their own lives. So for example, the general recommendation when it comes to PFAS is to not use sort of like scratched non-stick cookware.
Right.
It can that Teflon coating contains PFAS, and it can leach out more into the foods that you're cooking when it's scratched or damaged in any other way. And so you want to replace that cookware.
I've got some pretty scratched up.
I know. I was just looking at Alex and thinking, do I have scratched up cookware?
Oh, I thought you were going to be judgmental of me. Like I was looking at Alex, he for sure has scratched up pans in his kitchen.
Well,
and you're right,
too.
by the way.
Well, that too.
Yeah, no, that's interesting too. Are there other things like really like, I think a lot of people listening are going to think like, okay, what about me? What about my house? Because that's what I'm thinking, frankly. And are there other kind of common things that we're focusing on? I know, like you said, we've made like big improvements in lead and stuff like that, but are there sort of particular chemicals that we're seeing that are like emerging concerns or that are more in the forefront right now? You mentioned PFAS for sure.
Yeah, so that's sort of like the follow-up to what we see as a lot of environmental chemicals coming down in the population, and so those levels decreasing. The flip side of that is, of course, if those chemicals are going away, then what replaces them? Mm-hmm. And so, it's maybe not everyone's first thought when you see a BPA-free, sticker on a product to think, well, what's in it if it's not BPA? And so there can be some cases where those chemicals are swapped out for a very similar chemical. In the case of BPA, there can be things like bisphenol S or bisphenol F, which is just a different letter of the alphabet and a slight change to the chemical structure. But what we see is that, the properties of the chemical can be the same as BPA. And so alongside that, the sort of health risks of the chemical can be the same. And so it's not worth, it's not necessary to worry about it. The levels are still, very low and not of a risk to people, but it's, something to consider when you are making those decisions around avoiding exposures to certain chemicals. You don't want to mistakenly, encounter new and different ones.
I've seen a lot of my friends sort of reverting back to like, okay, I'm only using cast iron or like steel pans from now on.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. Friends with like young kids, especially too. We're all kind of a little, I think it's interesting too. And it underlines the importance of monitoring, right? Because otherwise we don't know.
We wouldn't know.
Yeah.
Feels like reading labels is part of the way we need to be informed and, think about our own risk levels. Do you have any advice about like reading labels when we're shopping?
Yeah, so there's, it's not always intuitive which chemicals should stand out on a label. Of course, when I read them, I'm like, oh, that's one that we measured.
It's intuitive for you, Tyler.
Yeah.
For me, I'm going to be honest, I'm not reading a lot of the label in detail.
I need a very clear, like, bad. Good.
BPA free, I like that. But then I don't even really know what it means. But if you have any hot tips on like shopping and labels.
Yeah, so it's really challenging because if you look at the back of that personal care product that you're shopping for, whether it's like a lotion or toothpaste or, deodorant, like there's going to just be a really long list of chemicals. And so, generally what I would recommend is it's becoming more and more possible to become familiar with sort of like the broad, the sort of high level chemical groups. And it's becoming more and more tangible to sort of slot chemicals into those groups. And so like, again, phthalates, parabens, these are all tend to be more on people's radar because they're, usually a label on the product. But it's still, it's really challenging to understand what like 1,2,3 hexabromo cyclodecane might be. And
Well, and I think part of it too, like we talked earlier about like, are chemicals bad, right? Yeah. And like, I think it's challenging too, because it's one of those things that when it's difficult to understand, we want to simplify it in our mind. So we want to say chemical. Oh, that sounds awful. But it's kind of, everything's different, right? It could be any element, right? So it's it's hard to navigate.
I have a good example of that. Clean makeup is like very trendy now. Someone who buys makeup and the blanket is just, it's clean, like you don't need to worry about what's in it. But you give makeup or personal care products as an example. It's one where I think also people are trying to get more informed, or at least it's people that I know are trying to get more informed about what's in it. And so when you're wondering about what's in it, like, is the best resource to start with like the company website and learning about what those products are?
So there's, like now that you mention it, there are some like apps and programs out there that will, you can scan a barcode and it will pull up sort of like a general rating of the product.
Okay.
Of course, the caution with that is you always have to be mindful of like who's putting out that information.
Yeah, like it's the company themselves.
Yeah. Or someone or some company who's trying to sell you an alternative that they might advertise as being healthier,
okay.
But maybe, more expensive or the same thing. I think, by this point, like I mentioned, there's 5,000 or 6,000 chemicals that are, account for the vast majority of chemical production and the ones that you would likely encounter. Those are probably going to be largely the same, in all the products that you might encounter. For example, the different brands or different styles of couches are all like the same material at the end of the day. The different brands of, water bottles in the store, they're all the same type of plastic. And so, it's probably not necessary to compare for those things, but there are some products where you could look at, some contain certain chemicals like, paraben free or phthalate free that you might want to gravitate towards if you're interested in those.
I love that. It's like the balance of being like informed, but like let's not be obsessive about it.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's a good plug for Canada.ca too. If you want reliable health information about environmental contaminants, come and visit our website.
Yeah, we can link that specific page in our show notes.
I feel like I'm maybe not giving you too much, but there are a couple examples, again, more on the behavioral side of things that you can do, for example, the sort of like fun example that I like to give is don't microwave plastics.
Yes.
Like generally you should try and microwave things in glass or ceramic containers. I like to joke and say that when a plastic container says microwave safe, it means the container, not you.
Oh my God.
That's of course a joke. Like it doesn't mean that you're at some huge health risk just because you microwaved your pasta for lunch or dinner. But we know that, exposing those plastics to higher temperatures, like in the microwave, causes more of them to sort of leach into the food.
Sure.
And then of course you eat it. But I mean, at the end of the day, like, it's rest assured, like these chemicals, they may be in some cases contributing to the development of sort of health conditions. But really, like, there's so many different things in our lives that can cause various health conditions. And so it's all about, like, managing the risks and the benefits. And that's true for things totally outside my, like, expertise, things like I should probably eat a little bit better of a diet and I should probably exercise a little more. Well, I view chemicals as sort of like an extension to that. When possible, try and take actions to reduce your exposures to chemicals, like, not microwaving plastic containers.
That is great advice, Tyler.
Absolutely.
Very balanced and practical. Thank you. Before we close, I want to know from you, what are you the most excited about in your work to work on in the future? What are you looking forward to?
So recently within our program, we've been putting so much more effort into, like, communicating the results of the information. Of course, we've always been doing that, but it's primarily been to sort of the other teams, the other groups that are working on environmental chemicals,
Sure.
those groups that are responsible for things like evaluating the health risk and putting in place any regulations that are intended to reduce exposures. But of course, we know that people are interested in environmental chemicals, and so we're putting more and more effort into communicating the information and the results to more diverse audiences, including the general public. And so, I had already mentioned the development of those biomonitoring fact sheets. We also have what we refer to as the Canadian Biomonitoring Dashboard. And so it's a website. It's a web application where you can go on and you can search up, whichever chemical is top of your mind. And if we've measured it, you'll be presented with sort of the levels in the Canadian population, and you can go through and view if there are differences among the different age groups. So, like, are children and adolescents exposed at higher levels than, adults? Or are there changes in the levels in the Canadian population over time?
As a parent of a 3-year-old, I'm for sure going to be doing that after this. No, it's a great resource, so that's interesting.
Yeah, cool. It's good to know that there's a lot more information out there if people want to know a lot more, right?
Definitely.
Excellent. Tyler, this has been a great conversation. We're going to go check our pans when we get home.
Mm-hmm. Run the water for a few minutes before I drink it and all the other things.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to Healthy Canadians. If you're watching on YouTube, click the like button and subscribe to stay up to date on all future episodes. Find us wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a review if you like what you heard. For more information on health topics that matter to you, visit canada.ca/health.